Well, I'm over the moon excited.
Yeah, no, I'm really thrilled. I was like, do you think there's any way we could get Debbie Millman?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really honored. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy.
And I'm Jamie, and this is Clever. Today, we're talking to Debbie fucking Millman.
She's so awesome.
He is awesome. And so awesome that I don't even know where to start because this woman has done so much. If you're a human who's been alive and breathing for the last few years, you've definitely been touched by her work. She's a designer, but she's also a noteworthy brand strategist, an author, educator, podcaster, and philanthropist.
For 20 years, she was the president of the design division of Sterling Brands, where she worked with over 200 of the world's largest brands, including Star Wars and Burger King, among others. She's authored several books, including How to Think Like a Great Graphic Designer, Brand Thinking and Other Noble Pursuits, and she's published and exhibited her artwork and visual essays in magazines, books, and museums all over the globe. Plus, she co-founded the first graduate program in branding at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And she's a pioneering podcaster with her show Design Matters.
Yeah, we would probably not be doing this podcast if it weren't for Debbie Millman. So thank you, Debbie.
Yay!
So this woman has heart, substance, wisdom for miles, and she's a powerful force for good in the world. So let's talk to Debbie Millman.
My name is Debbie Millman, and I am a native New Yorker and still living in Manhattan. I am a designer, a writer, an educator, a brand strategist, and host of the podcast Design Matters. I also am the editorial and creative director of Print Magazine. Why do I do what I do?
Yeah, why?
Because if I didn't do it, I would die.
That's a very long list, lady.
Yeah, I'm old. What can I tell you?
No.
I'm old and I've gotten very good at multitasking.
All right, so let's get right into it. Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
Oh, God.
Did we open a can of worms? I can't wait to hear all of it.
Oh, no, really? Okay, well, I'm a native New Yorker. As I said, I was born in Brooklyn, and I lived in Brooklyn for the first 2 years of my life. Then we moved to Howard Beach, Queens. I lived in Queens, New York for another 5 or so years. When I was in the third grade, my parents moved us to Staten Island, where my dad had bought his very own pharmacy. And I lived there for another 2 years. During that time, my parents got divorced, and my mother subsequently remarried very quickly and took my brother and I and her new husband and his 2 kids and moved us to Long Island. My father moved to Manhattan, and so I would have the weekends back and forth in a typical sort of Long Island suburban week and a very interesting, edgy, urban New York City in the 70s on the weekends. My childhood was dismal.
Oh, honey.
But, a lot of people have had dismal childhoods, so it's not something that anybody needs to feel sorry for me about.
No, and in fact, you're an amazing example of going from a dismal childhood to a really effective and prolific life.
Well, that's probably in large part because of the dismal childhood. My parents got married when they were very young. My mother was 18. My father was 21. They had no business getting married. I was born when my mother was 21. By the time she was 30, she was already divorced one time en route to another. She had somewhat questionable taste in partners. My dad he died last year. He was brilliant and charismatic and incredibly well-spoken, but also had some anger issues, which really impacted me. And my mom has always sort of been very talented, super artistic, but also really ungrounded. And they didn't spend a lot of time taking care of their kids. Really long and short of it is they shouldn't have had kids so early. They didn't know how to manage childhood and life. And so my siblings and I were mostly left to care for ourselves.
I was fairly independent as a child, and it sounds like you were too with your siblings. Did that help you in any way? Maybe that manifested itself in being more creative or more resourceful, or just more of a entrepreneur?
It's a good question. Having a father who had his own business, especially in a pharmacy, I think was incredibly formative for me in that I, at a very young age, would work the cash register in his pharmacy. And that I think really influenced my deep-seated understanding of why and how people choose the things that they buy. I think I understood that intrinsically very, very young. I also had this very interesting time where I would spend quite a lot of imaginative effort with the things that he was selling. So I would get very involved in trying to understand, who were the people on these packages? Who was the girl on the Stayfree napkins packaging? And I would, she had this beautiful dress and she was standing on the beach and looked like she had a really perfect life. And I'd project into her, who is this? Why is she so happy? And I would try to understand, I guess, the perspective of the package in a lot of ways. And I think that was really when my interest in branding began, really unbeknownst to me. My fascination with products, with branding, with the relationship that people have with products and with branding was born of my own curiosity and probably a desire to project myself into other worlds, to experience different feelings and different realities.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think that was a product of trying to protect yourself and escape from your sort of current fractured and hostile situation?
Yeah, and I mean, yes, it was a very fractured and hostile situation, but I don't doubt that my parents loved me. I don't doubt that they wanted me to have a good life. I just don't think they quite understood how to manage their own lives in the process. Mm-hmm. And also, my father was, as I said, brilliant. And I would like to think that I got a lot of my business savvy from him. My mother was incredibly artistic and was the person who taught me how to draw. So it's a mixed bag. I don't want in any way to paint a picture of it being a complete scenario of neglect and rejection, because it wasn't. It was painful. There were incredibly hard things that I had to undergo and things that were criminal that I had to face. But I think that they also, and I know this in my heart, did the very best that they could given the circumstances that they were in. Do I wish they did things differently? Yes, but don't we always?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all kind of understand the pain of people who love you but don't have the tools to take care of you properly or to take care of their own lives.
And I have the benefit of hindsight now in understanding that while it's taken decades to make sense of it all, I'm extremely grateful for where I am now in my life. And I think Seth Godin says it best when people ask him, what would he tell his 30-year-old self or what would he change? And he says nothing. He'd want to go through exactly the same thing again because it resulted in him being exactly who he is right now. And I feel similarly.
Children are frequently, they don't have the coping skills yet. They're developing them as they grow up, and they're frequently sort of reaching out to connect with their parents in ways that are maybe fruitful or misguided. But you talked about this really rich, creative inner life where you would project yourself into the situations that you found on, shampoo bottles. And also your mom teaching you to draw. Were those sort of pockets of familial love and safety that helped you grow those areas? Or were they a coping mechanism to protect you, or both?
I think probably both. I can't begin to describe how endlessly fascinated I was by products, by brands. I was madly in love with Goody Bretts. I've written at length about my coveting one of the Bretts, a ponytail holder that my best friend, next door neighbor had, and we must have been about 7 or 8 years old, not even. And I wanted this barrette that she had so badly that I stole it. And I mean, this is how much power I put into these objects, where somehow the accumulation of these goods, these external factors, would buoy up an otherwise really fragile center. And I felt more beautiful. I felt more normal. I felt more acceptable if I had these things that somehow represented what I imagined happy, normal little girls had. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know that I was really stealing the ponytail holder. I think I was trying to steal some of the security that my friend Andrea felt in her family. I spent a lot of time next door in her house with her and her parents. And I think that it was a combination of wanting something that I couldn't have, but also associating what I couldn't have with something tangible that I could imagine owning.
That's really interesting. Well, we can get to this later when we talk about your professional life, but because you don't just design pretty campaigns to sell products, you really do get into the psychology of what they mean to people. And Jamie and I are big fans of sort of interpreting the objects that we surround ourselves with as an external truth of what lies within.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when I was in 7th grade was probably one of the most violently brutal times of my life. My stepfather was criminal and treated me very, very badly, very, very violently, and very abusively. And I, at the time, became obsessed with Levi's and Lacoste. And we did not have a lot of money. And I desperately wanted the uniform that everybody was wearing at school. Mm-hmm. And I wanted a pair of Levi's and I wanted a Lacoste polo shirt. And I remember begging my mother for them. And she was also a seamstress, and her response to these ridiculously overpriced things that she felt were not worth the money was to sew a little red tag on the back pocket of one of my existing pairs of what she called dungarees, mm-hmm. and then going to the Lee Ward's craft store to find some sort of embroidered emblem that she could hot glue to my polo shirt. I don't think she understood at the time that for me, that would be worse. That would be worse. Actually having something that was a replica of the real thing was worse than not having the real thing. And she finally relented, and I think for the holidays ended up buying me a pair of Levi's that she found. She must have found them in like a triple markdown bin at the local mall. They were lime green corduroy bell bottoms. And I wore them every day. I wore them every day because somehow I thought, and despite the fact that they were lime green, despite the fact that they were corduroy, and despite the fact that they were bell bottoms, I felt that just appearing more normal, appearing more like everybody else, that meant that I was. And those things at the time, at least temporarily, because that's all brands really can do is temporarily give you the fix, gave me a sense of confidence, of security.
Do you think even back then you were kind of doing the fake it till you make it thing?
No, I don't think I was doing the fake it till I make it. First of all, I wouldn't have even known that I could ever have become anything. I was doing whatever I could to pretend that I was okay, mm-hmm. and to let myself somehow imagine the possibility that I could be just like everybody else on the outside. Nobody would need to know my interior life if I looked just like everybody else on the outside. That's also what's given me great, great insight into the limitations that brands have in our lives. And as Dan Pink will say, if your idea of a happiness is a flat screen TV, then you're playing a fool's game, because those things metabolize very quickly. We metabolize everything. I metabolized the Levi's probably within a couple of months. We are regulation machines, and that's part of why we're so addicted to things like Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. They give us the same hit of dopamine that a new pair of shoes gives us, or that a new flat screen TV gives us, and we become addicted to that feeling. The problem with that feeling is that it metabolizes, just like hunger, just like being hot or cold, just like love. And we're in a situation where we continually need more if that's what's fueling our sense of self. We need more likes or more friends or more fake followers. And that's part of the conundrum that we're living in today about using these external devices or external brands to persuade ourselves that we're acceptable or liked or loved.
This is really interesting. I'm thinking a lot about this and a lot about my childhood and my relationship with brands, but also thinking like, sometimes these things can be really positive things in our lives, like really help us get through times that are difficult. But then on the flip side, you could get into this, situation where you're constantly needing to acquire something or needing some sort of external confirmation to make yourself feel better. It's a rocky road. You could go down either path.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time as an adult rebuilding my childhood library. Actually, I'm at the point now where I have most of the books that impacted me as I was growing up. And I spent a lot of time reading, and that was probably some of my happiest times. And having those books around me gives me a supreme sense of joy, a supreme sense of happiness. And rereading them just makes me, it's like evidence of a life. And it gives me such a sense of hope and such a sense of warmth and all that's genuine in the world. I can't explain it any better than that, but it's something that's really meaningful to me.
Do you think products are symbols and what they represent really boils down to what we individually imbue them with?
Well, they're constructs. They're constructs just like everything else. A brand is a result. A brand is not a journey. A brand is the result of positioning. And if a company doesn't do the positioning, then a person will do the positioning for themselves. It's a process of understanding. It's meaning manufacture. We imbue the things around us with all sorts of power. And we do that from everything, including the apple that we give the teacher to the symbol that we wear around our necks to indicate what spiritual belief we have, to the sneakers we wear, to the phones we carry. So these are all things that we imbue with a sense of meaning, and we buy into that meaning. If a company is positioning something in a way that resonates with us, we accept or reject it, and we incorporate those values and those emotions into our own lives. But I also think that, for example, in regards to our addiction to social media or to our devices, Dan Formosa said it really well. We're not really in love with the devices. We're in love with the feeling that we get from the devices and that connectivity or that sense of belonging or acceptance. And I think we do the same thing with brands. And brands are really just constructs. It's just a symbol that is allowing you to understand what this thing is. And while most people use brands to describe commercial ventures or commercial products, they're really, in its most basic sense, a profound manifestation of the human spirit, in that we're using these things to create meaning around reality. And so every symbol, every product, every experience resonates with a series of chemical reactions in our brains that allow us to perceive them. And that construction is what ultimately results in brands.
This is fascinating.
It's so fascinating. I do want to bring it back to Debbie Millman, yourself.
See how well deftly I avoided that?
Yes. Well, I mean, you did lay something kind of heavy on us. You talked about the 7th grade being incredibly abusive at the hands of your stepfather. We'll transition from that pretty quickly. I don't need you to relive that for us, but I do wonder, in the course of your development, was that the most trying episode of your life, or was it the subsequent, having to sort through that and make sense of that trauma?
Big time trauma like that actually takes decades to process. And most of the time when things like that happen to children, young people, the body it's an interesting, in the brain, it's such an interesting mechanism in that often we are unable to process it because we can't handle the grief.
Yeah.
It takes a long time to be able to sort of build yourself up to be able to go into that quagmire. And it took me a long time, and it's still taking me a long time to fully process it all. I had 2 really really difficult times over the course of my life. And, I'm in my mid 50s. So this is something that's been a lifelong journey. That obviously was one experience. And then when my father died a year and a half ago, I also went through, at that point, I would classify that as an outright depression. It was a very unexpected death for me. We had a very complicated relationship, but in as much as it was complicated, he also had more impact on who I am and what I am than anyone else in my life. And so that was something that really shook me to the core. And I also went through a number of other experiences right around that time, moving and a breakup and a whole number of different things that really catapulted me into a time of reckoning. But I was able to manage through that, and as painful as it was, and I really call it in many ways a shattering of my life at that point, the subsequent rebuild is so much stronger and so much less anxious.
Oh, that gives me so much hope. That's amazing to hear. And I do think sometimes when a structure is built on a foundation that's starting to crumble over time, shattering is what needs to happen in order to rebuild it.
I approach the origins of our reality more from a scientific perspective than necessarily a spiritual perspective. But there are moments when I really feel like the universe is telling you something. And if you're unwilling to face certain things, you result in having to. And I probably giving away way too much power to the universe, but all that being said, I definitely feel like the universe was sort of forcing me to face things that I had spent a good amount of my life really not facing. But you can only say these things in retrospect. I said this to Tim Ferriss on his podcast. Making decisions are only really difficult when you're in the process of making them. Afterward, everything seems like, oh, that makes sense now. And going through it was a lot more difficult than the aftermath. I can look back on it and say, oh, well, I'm so much stronger now, and I'm really grateful for the experience. And at the time, I would have said, fuck you for doing this to me, universe.
Of course.
Totally.
Glad to know you're human.
Totally. Like, haven't I been through enough?
So I want to ask you, and this can kind of transition us into your work, but it sounds like a lot of the work that you have done has really helped contribute to realizations in your life about how you were coping with things as a child. Was there any point in this journey where you had like a couple of aha moments where you just felt like, oh, this is a breakthrough? Like, now that I figured this out, I know why I did X, Y, and Z.
I have such an issue with the whole aha thing, because I think ahas are just the culmination of a process. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. There are moments of clarity that I have about certain constructs that I tell myself, things that I believe very much to be true, and then something will happen. I'll have an experience, and then I realize what a fool I was, and that's just, total crap. One of the things that I talk a lot about is the notion of busyness, and how people tend to use busy as a badge, and it seems to be a moment of pride when you can tell people that you're too busy. And I say busy is a decision, that we do the things that we want to do. If you say you're too busy to do something, then chances are it's because you don't want to do it enough, and it's just not a priority. And that was a real aha moment for me. So now whenever I feel like I'm too busy to take something else on or to do something, I have to face the fact that it's just not something I want to do enough. So I'm unwilling to make that sacrifice, or unwilling to put in that time, or unwilling to turn off Law & Order SVU in order to do it. There's so many things that we tell ourselves. And that's one of the things that I think we tell ourselves, which is, oh, I'm too busy, I can't do it. With students will say, I'm too busy, I didn't get a chance to do the homework. I'm like, really? Well, stop watching Game of Thrones so much, and then you can do your homework. So that's one, I guess, big aha moment. And then another aha moment that I guess I had recently, and this was, I think, last year, and I was just talking to Seth Godin about this on my podcast last week, about the notion of self-reliance. And part of something that I've learned over the years was revealed to me I've always been somebody that needed to save for a rainy day or have enough for a rainy day or to make sure that there's always this extra bit over here in case we run out. I've always been afraid of running out. This was going to be my last chance to do something. This was going to be my last chance for love, my last chance for happiness, my last opportunity to write a book, my last chance to go to X country to speak, whatever. I've learned that part of that has been my own lack of belief in being able to rely on myself, and that I was looking to these outside things to give me a sense of self and a sense of credibility or importance. And the moment that you realize that you can depend on yourself for whatever it is, I think there's a sense of freedom in terms of not feeling so dependent on other things to create meaning or purpose for oneself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not there yet.
Oh, I don't know that I'm there. I had one moment of it 3 months ago. I'm waiting for another one to happen.
What does that feel like? I mean, does it put more pressure on you prioritizing things, or does the prioritizing of your decisions come more naturally and more gracefully because you're aware of that?
Another really good question. I'm not familiar enough with the feeling to be able to go back in and re-engineer it. And it was just a moment. Really was. It was, I guess that's call an aha moment. There was an aha moment for you. It was like, oh, wow. But I remember it, and it's an aspiration to hold it, to feel it. And so I do have optimism about realizing that state again. It was sort of like, okay, as is second.
This is a question purely just because I need to know. On your journey to process your whole life, and you say you have more of a scientific bent on life, so I don't want to necessarily say enlightenment, but for lack of a better word.
No, but I do consider myself, so I believe in the Big Bang, and I'm constantly thinking about the singularity and what happened before the singularity and where the hydrogen and the helium come from. And believe me, these are things that I am obsessed with. In the middle of the night, I am thinking about these things and wishing that I could find the answers. But on the other hand, I do truly, truly believe that there's some magic that we just haven't been able to figure out yet. There are too many things that have happened to me in my life that have had a sense of magic in them. They're magical. And I can't explain that. So in the same way that I can't explain where the helium and the hydrogen came from, I am unable to explain why I feel that magic exists.
Ooh. But my question was going to be, as you've made these sort of breakthroughs or had these culmination of processing and you've reached a plateau, are you then confident and secure of your ability to stay at that plateau and not slip back down the slope into wherever you were before?
Well, confidence is one of those really, really squishy words. And I agree with the great writer Danny Shapiro, who has stated that confidence is overrated. And confidence is not nearly as important as courage. And the reason why I believe this is because it's in my estimation that confidence comes after repetitive success at any endeavor. That's how confidence is developed. You are not born confident to jump off a diving board. You become confident to jump off the diving board after repetitive attempts at that endeavor that are successful, that don't result in you cracking your head open. And so I believe that confidence is only born from the notion that you can envision a successful outcome based on your experience. What's so much more important is the ability to take that first step prior to the confidence being born.
Hot damn, you just cracked my head open. You're so right. Keep going. Keep going. Don't stop.
So it's that first step, the step into the unknown, the step into, I have the faith that this could work out well. And that is what I try to preach to everyone. And I tell all my students now, confidence is the successful, repetitive endeavor. That's what it is. A great baseball player gets up to bat and has the confidence to be able to hit the ball because he knows he can hit the ball and it's been done before, and they're going to get all of those circumstances and hope that they all align in the same way based on repetitive success at that endeavor. That's what you have to keep searching for. That's what gives you confidence. That's what confidence is born from.
Okay. There's
What
a
was
lot
the
to
question?
There's a lot to process here.
Yes.
I want to bring it back to your work though, because I'm really curious to know, like, at what point were you exposed to the concept of branding or identity or graphic arts or whatever as a profession? Was it in college? Was it in high school? And like, how did you get on that trajectory?
Well, what's interesting in that I was obsessed with this Stayfree napkins packaging or the Lay's potato chips packaging or the Wise potato chips. I loved potato chips growing up. I still do. I drew an illustration with the Lay's potato chips logo in it when I was like 8 years old. I wasn't consciously aware that this was a discipline. I wasn't consciously aware that it was something I could pursue as a career. And I just was fascinated by it because I was surrounded by it. And this was, to me, some sort of creative path that I could participate in, but not as a practitioner, as a consumer, not knowing that word either, though, but just as somebody that liked these things, felt something amidst these things. When I was in college, I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And when I worked on the student newspaper, when I became the editor of the arts and features section, it was my responsibility also to lay out the paper. And so that was when I first became aware of design. And that was in my senior year of college. I took one class of design in my whole life. When I graduated, I found myself working across the disciplines, both in editorial as well as design, and pretty much have done that my entire career. I became aware of the notion of a branding consultancy when I was in my 30s, believe it or not. I had been working as a designer and as a writer up through my early 30s. And after working at a design firm called Frankfurt Ballkind, I was headhunted. I was cold called by a headhunter first time in my life. And they were looking for somebody to work in a branding consultancy. They were trying to find a person for a company named the Schechter Group, and they were looking for somebody to do sales. And I was so unhappy at that job at the time that I needed to get out of there. I needed to find something else, and took basically the first job that came along. And it was doing sales and marketing at a brand consultancy. And up through my early 30s, most of my career endeavors were experiments in rejection and failure. They were not things that I was terribly proud of, nor was getting this particular job, because it was really at a moment of desperation when I just needed anything to be able to get a paycheck to pay my rent. What I very quickly found out was, because of my intrinsic understanding of branding that was born probably when I was standing in the aisle looking at the Stayfree packaging, I don't know if it was an innate talent. I don't know if it was just a natural talent. I don't know. I was good at it. I was really good at it. And I seemed to have this ability to tap into the emotions of people as they're making their choices about what to put in their supermarket cart. It's a very unusual talent. And so that's how my career in branding was born. It was almost like putting on a pair of sneakers and running around a track and realizing you can run fast, never having run before. And it was exactly like that. It was like, oh my God, I'm good at something.
Oh, that must have felt amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was the first time in my life, in my early 30s, that I was naturally good at something that was actually able to result in my being paid well for it.
And then did you have the wherewithal and the savvy to engineer your career so that you were supported and had the opportunity to really excel and reach the potential of your skills?
Well, it's so interesting. I didn't quite at that moment. Something interesting happens when you do achieve some confidence in your ability to do something. And I think, and I've never really thought about it in this way until right now, but I think realizing that I was good at something did give me the ability to fight a little bit more for my right to be good at it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in the first job at the Schechter Group, Schechter was an independent company that was ultimately acquired by a holding company and merged with Interbrand. And in that transition, quite a lot of the people around me that I had been working with for a couple of years all very, very quickly left. And I wasn't sure how or if this little faction of the company was going to be able to survive. And again, I was quite worried about being able to take care of myself. And this gets back to that whole notion of, can you rely on yourself? At that point, I did not think I could rely on myself. And then if I didn't have a job, I would die and end up homeless, or I would end up homeless and die. And so I very quickly found another job. And that was my job at Sterling. I called up Roz Goldfarb, who was a headhunter, and I asked her if she had anything for me and anything that might fit my talents. And she said that she knew of this man, Simon Williams, who was the founder of this company called the Sterling Group. At the time, it was called the Sterling Group. It had been born from a much bigger company called Michael Peters, which was a very big branding consultancy in the UK. Michael Peters had come to the United States and opened up a couple of different offices, one in New York, one in Minnesota, and then an office in Canada. And I think was a real product of the 80s and overspent and ultimately ended up going bankrupt. Simon Williams bought the New York business for $1 and started Sterling. Joe Duffy was the managing director of the Minnesota office and then started Duffy and Partners. So about 2 years into the tenure of this once defunct company or once bankrupt company, Simon is trying to rebuild it, and I come along. And at the time when I left the Schechter Group, I had a number of different opportunities. Right when I started at Sterling, there was an opportunity to potentially work at Landor. There was an opportunity to potentially work at Wallace Church. But ultimately, I felt that I could have the most impact at Sterling because they were really kind of rock bottom. They had just come out of bankruptcy. I remember somebody telling me that I was on a suicide mission with my career going to Sterling because of that, because of their reputation. But there was something about Simon Williams that I felt we were kindred spirits. There was something about him that I trusted. And it ended up being the best decision I've ever made. I ended up staying at Sterling for 22 years. And Simon Williams, still a dear, dear friend, a sibling in many, many ways. And he and I and Austin McGee, who was our third partner, came in about 8 or 10 years after I was there, ultimately built this company out of bankruptcy into what was it when we sold it to Omnicom in 2008. It was about 150 people in 4 offices and gave me a certain independence that I never imagined possible. Never, ever imagined possible. I ended up staying at Sterling for another 7 years, although the last 2 years were developing my exit strategy with Simon. I was offered the CEO position. He was thinking about moving into the chairman role. But at that point, I had really built a life outside of Sterling that I was ready to move into full time between my program at the School of Visual Arts, my master's in branding program, and all of the writing that I'd been doing and my podcast, and was really ready to take that leap. It was terrifying, though, and that's why it took me 7 years after the sale of our company to be able to say, okay, I'm ready to jump. But it was terrifying in a lot of ways. And it was hard to turn down the CEO position. I, in many ways, felt like this is the only thing I know I've ever really, really been good at. Maybe I'm supposed to take this job. Maybe I'm supposed to take it to the next level. Maybe I'm supposed to go to the next level in this realm. And I thought about it for 4 months. And Simon, because he knows me so well, finally said, Debbie, anything that takes you 4 months to decide is probably something you don't want to do.
Oh, yeah.
So I was like, I think you're right. But I also had a remarkable conversation with a woman that had formerly been the general manager of Puma. And she had left her job at Puma and started her own specialty food store. And I asked her how she did it. Like, how did you jump? How'd you make the jump? And she said, I just had to let go of the trapeze. And in that moment, I had this vision of myself stuck with my arms and legs crooked around 5 different trapeze. And in order to be able to do what I wanted to do next, I had to let go. I had to drop at least 1 or 2 and start to prepare for the next big leap. And it was very hard to do. And I think that was one of the moments of that reliability feeling that I had. Like, okay, I know if I do this, I can rely on myself. I won't end up homeless, dead in the middle of the street, that kind of thing.
So no regrets.
I think the only regrets that I have are not doing things that I have always wanted to do soon enough. I was worried about, dying, ending up homeless, dead in the street. If I were dying in the street, I don't think I would be regretting the things that I did that were courageous. I think I'd only be regretting the things that I did in order to protect myself from the fear about being courageous. I didn't come out quite as eloquently as I wanted it to, but you get the point.
I get the point, and I also get the point that fear of dying homeless in the street is that thing that kept you from doing things, or that reluctance.
Yeah. Feeling like I can't protect myself, feeling like I can't stand up for myself. And so in that time at Sterling and working with Simon for 20 something years, we really learned how to work together. It was one of the most successful relationships of my life. And I don't mean personal relationship. It was an entirely professional relationship, but we learned how to compromise. We learned how to navigate conflict. We learned how to disagree without fighting. We learned how to trust each other. And I will never, ever, ever regret staying for as long as I did in order to achieve that type of working relationship with someone.
I'm listening to you talk and I'm I'm enraptured, enchanted, enthralled, but mostly I'm getting the sense that I think your students might get. You have a kind of patience, you're an excellent listener, but you've also thought through your theses so carefully that you know how to express them in a way that somebody else will get it. And so I feel like you're a natural, maybe not natural born educator. Maybe you've really figured out how to be an educator through your own learning process. But I'm wondering, is that something that fueled your desire to create this program at SVA?
I think sometimes we're thwarted by our own ability to imagine what is possible for our futures. And I never imagined even being capable or talented enough to be able to do something like this. My master's in branding program really began because Steve Heller, who had been developing new graduate programs at the School of Visual Arts and had a super successful master's program in design and designer as entrepreneur, approached me in 2007 and asked me if I would be interested in starting a master's program in branding. And I was astounded. I'm still astounded in Steve's ability to make things happen and transform people's lives. And at that point, I knew that we were getting ready for the acquisition while I was at Sterling. This was the year before. And I thought, oh my God, this timing might work out just great because we're going to be selling the company. We'll have a couple of years where we have to have what is called an earn-out, where you have to continue working with the company to ensure its long-term success, even without you. And thought the timing would be perfect. So I started doing this program and created it as a night program for working professionals mostly, so me, the working professional, could teach. It turned out it works really well because so many working professionals can do a program like this and not have to give up working. I had been teaching undergraduate education for about 3 years before, also at the School of Visual Arts. And that class was about, and it's still, because I still teach it, I teach it to seniors, it's about how to get a job when you graduate. And so because I had gone through all of my own, as I said, experiments and failure and rejection and machinations and trying to make something happen for myself, it was very easy for me to help students recalibrate what their own expectations are as they're about to graduate, because that's precisely the moment that people begin compromising and people begin thinking, oh, I'm not really good enough to do that, so I'll do that instead, when they're editing their own possibilities before they're even possible. So that class gave me quite a lot of, and still gives me quite a lot of joy, because I see so many students come out of that class really willing to take a chance on their own greatness. And I love being able to help do that. The branding program is something, as I said, I never imagined, but because I do love teaching so much, it's created this ability for me to, what I hope, influence the whole discipline of branding and move it away from a purely commercial endeavor and give people the notion that branding, as I said, is this manifestation of the human experience, and the condition of brands reflect the condition of our culture. What's so exciting for me now to see in branding, so to speak, are things like Black Lives Matter, because we're then, as a culture, creating this construct that turns into a movement that has nothing to do with any kind of commercial outcome. This is a cultural outcome. Right. This is changing the world, and it's done through creating an intellectual construct that we see as a brand, so to speak. A brand is, as I said, just meaning manufacture. And so we're manufacturing meaning around this that we then can use to communicate, that we can use to change. And Seth Godin was at a conference that my students put on a couple of months ago about politics and branding, and he said something profound. He said, government doesn't make culture, culture makes government. And if, as I do, you believe that the condition of brands reflects the condition of our culture, then the condition of our brands influences the condition of our government. And I believe that whether it be the Pussy Hat, or whether it be Black Lives Matter, whether it be Je suis Charlie for the Charlie Hebdo trauma, tragedy, all of these things give us the ability to connect with each other and make change. And I think we need that now more than ever before.
Sing it, sister.
Oh,
thank you. You are so right. And
absolutely.
I'm so moved to hear you talk about it that way.
But in terms of teaching, and here's another sort of political statement I'll make. I went to public school my whole life. I went to public college. I went to a state university, and I had a remarkable education. And most of my teaching is influenced by the great teachers that I had. And I had a very difficult freshman year in college, just making that transition from a very small suburban high school to a very large university, and felt very lonely and didn't do well academically in my first year because of it. In my sophomore year, I had a teacher who's still at SUNY Albany. Her name is Professor Helen Regaro Elam. And she was the first person in my academic career, my academic life, that actually made me feel smart. And she didn't make me feel smart because I'm smart. She made me feel smart because that's how she taught. And she gave people the tools to become smarter. And she did this with everybody. And the way in which she encouraged discourse in the class, the way in which she encouraged people to take chances on their ideas is something that has always stayed with me. And that's very much the way I try to teach.
I would like to take your class.
Seriously.
I mean, among all of your professional and academic thought leadership, I just want to segue to a personal project for a second. You created a very personal book of illustrated essays and visual poems called Self-Portrait as Your Traitor.
Yes.
And I'm impressed with the courage and vulnerability you must have embraced in order to put a piece like this out. And I want you to talk about the work and your process and what you had to summon up from within in order to feel like you could put this out in the world.
Well, I took a class with Milton Glaser in 2005 at the School of Visual Arts. He was teaching summer intensives for many decades. And I applied to his summer intensive in 2005. And one of the exercises in the class, and I've talked about this at length on Tim Ferriss's podcast for anybody that really wants to hear more about this specific exercise. One of the exercises in the class was to write a 5-year plan. What would your life look like in 5 years if you could have anything in the world that you wanted? And so I wrote this essay, and I also, because I'm a bit OCD, I wrote a list. So I wrote an essay about what my life would look like in 5 years, and then I wrote a list of what I wanted my life to encompass in 5 years. And I do this exercise now with my students, but I do it in 10 years because they're younger and I want to give them a little bit more runway. But I did it for 5 years, and I put all of these really grandiose goals, and one of them was to have a book of illustrated essays. Now, I hadn't been doing illustrated essays at that point for quite some time. I had given up quite a lot of my artwork and my pursuit doing art when I really started to take my career at Sterling very seriously and didn't make the time to do the artwork. And so this was my way of telling myself I want to start doing this again, and I want to do it well enough to be able to publish a book someday. And I took this essay very, very seriously. And about a year later, I did a sample visual essay based on one of the monologues I had written at the beginning of Design Matters, back when the show first had those little stories I used to tell. And I sent it off to a woman who I knew at F&W Media, who I thought would be possibly open to seeing something like this. Didn't hear back. But 6 weeks later, I thought, well, maybe I'll ping her again and see if she got it and see what she says, because she hasn't said no yet, so maybe it's still something she's considering. When I sent her the email, she responded and said she'd never gotten anything from me, and could I please send it again? I'm not surprised, because this visual essay was quite a large file, so who knows where it might have gone. So I sent it to her again, and she saw it and got it and responded that she would present it to her editorial board, but it was generally the kind of book that F&W Media was doing. F&W is the publisher of Print Magazine and How Magazine, and they also have an imprint for books. And so she went and presented it to the editorial board, and she came back a couple of weeks later and said, well, they've accepted it. They'll do it. And I wrote her back and said, that's a miracle. And she was like, yes, Debbie, it really is. So I did this book. And I was really at the time quite rusty in my ability to do these essays. I hadn't been doing them regularly for a long time. And so what happens when you start doing something again, you have to build up the muscles. And so I was building up my muscles, and as I did each essay, every one I'd like more than the one before. So then I'd go back and do them over. And so finally F&W had to cut me off, and they were like, okay, the book is done. This is it. No more changes. And it went to press, and I was really, really worried that the muscle that I had built up at that point, I'd lose if I didn't keep making visual essays. And so I asked Print Magazine, who I'd been doing a regular column for print in the magazine, I asked them if I could post visual essays every month, because I wanted to keep my chops. So they didn't have to pay me, just I have this deadline, I'm just going to put up what I do, and would they be willing to let me do that? And they were like, sure, absolutely. So I started to do that, and after 3 years, I was fanatical about this. I put a deadline in my head, and I was like, I need to do this. I have to do this. I have to do my essay. And so I did. After 3 years, 36 of these things. And then the then publisher of print, came to me and said, let's do another book. And I was like, okay. And that's how it all happened. Almost all of those essays, except the last one, which was done just because I was finishing the book. All of those essays were done as a way to keep doing visual essays. And that's how Self-Portrait happened.
I love it.
In terms of the vulnerability, it's sort of like I said, the same concept of making decisions. Making decisions are hard in the process of making them. Once you've made them, they're not as hard. Thinking about revealing something that makes you feel vulnerable is only hard in the moments leading up to it actually happening. Once it's done, you're like, what was I so worried about? What was I so afraid of? It is what it is.
So you don't still have pangs of like knowing that book is out there in the world floating around, revealing your inner self to total strangers?
No.
Awesome.
In a word.
I want to ask you, like, was there a cathartic value to creating this work?
I guess so. It's not like running a marathon or doing any kind of physical endeavor and then like, whew, I'm done, yay, and feeling sort of accomplished. I think it was satisfying. It's always really satisfying for me to make things. Mm-hmm. I have found in my life that I am happiest when I'm making things, when I'm doing things with my hands, when I'm constructing things, when I'm making a podcast, when I'm making a lesson plan, when I'm making art, when I'm writing, anything that requires the imagination, anything that requires connectivity gives me enormous amounts of joy. And having that effort culminate in something tangible feels really special.
Yeah. I can relate to that.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that, you're very prolific. I mean, between the essays and all the other things that you do, I mean, that long list you rattled off at the beginning of this is overwhelming. As someone who also makes art, I sometimes struggle with keeping my tank fueled and being creative and just getting it out. Or do you ever struggle with that because you are doing so much? How do you keep fueled to keep going?
I struggle with doing things well. I've been doing more work on canvas lately, and it is a street fight. I have had a lot of challenges making things that I think have any value at all. I don't mean financial value, I just mean artistic value. It's been a slugfest, and it's scary because it might be just because, again, the muscles aren't there in that discipline, but I worry about the lack of ease. And I don't mean ease as in easy, I mean ease as in sort of a purposeful sense of working in this medium and it being so hard. There's this sense of, it's really fear, I guess, of it not ever being something that I master. And so I worry about that. Should it be this hard to do something? But I guess everything is hard. It's just a matter of how much you can tolerate. Mm. So I worry about that. I'm very rarely at a loss for motivation. I am often at a loss of the muse, and that can be difficult because I definitely depend on sparks for my ideas.
Yeah.
They tend to be, they spark in me as opposed to develop. And I'm sure that they're developing into that spark. They're germinating, and there's all sorts of combinatorial creativity that's happening. But most of my ideas come while I'm walking and get the spark. And so I sometimes get frustrated because I'm waiting for the idea, and I'm thinking and I'm thinking and I'm thinking and I'm expecting a spark to come because I've been rubbing those damn twigs together for like a week, and where is the spark? And I worry about that, but usually they come, usually.
You haven't found the magic trick that makes the spark come on command?
No, I think Elizabeth Gilbert says it really well in her TED Talk. You just have to sit down and wait for it to come by doing the work every day.
Just showing up?
Yeah, just showing up. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's actually a relief to hear that you find something hard to do or that you struggle sometimes with this, because I often struggle with it, and I make a lot of stuff that a lot of it I throw out. But every once in a while, something's really good, and then I get to keep it.
Yeah, keep even the things that you don't like. I find that sometimes those things can be the foundation of something else. I tend not to get rid of too much unless I'm actually truly embarrassed by it. I did this thing with Fred once, and I was so humiliated by the outcome that I had to throw it away. But mostly I just keep things in a file and can pull them out if I want to use them for collaging or for ideas for other things. But no, everything is a struggle. It's very, very rare that something just comes pouring out of me. Very rare. That's happened maybe twice in my whole entire life. Actually, just once. I can only think of one time.
Oh, that must have felt like, okay, this is how we're going to do it now. And how disappointing when you go back to the next project and it's a struggle again.
But Elizabeth Gilbert talks about that in her TED Talk. And she talks about how there was I don't remember the names of the people, but there was a poet that was like working out in the field and was like running back to the kitchen to get a pad and a pencil because the poem was coming through her. And if she didn't write it down, she'd never have it back.
Yeah.
And somebody else, it was Tom Waits, I think, who was who wrote songs that way. They just come through you. And if you aren't near the guitar or a piece of paper or whatever it is, they're gone. Mm-hmm. And that moment was, if I hadn't had actually, no, I can think of two moments where if I didn't have access to something to write it down, that would have been gone forever.
It reminds me of people who like dream things and they have to wake up and write it down before they fall back asleep or they'll forget what they dreamt about.
Yeah, but that's the magic. That's the magic that I'm talking about. Like these things that appear from nothing. That is life.
Right. And that can't be explained by science, which is why it's magic.
Well, I'm sure there is some neuroscientist that can explain it, but I don't even know that I want to know.
Right. Right.
Yeah, then it ruins it because you're like, oh, it's just like neurotransmitters. I noticed that you're active with a foundation. It's called the Joyful Heart Foundation. Can you talk a little bit more about your mission and what you do there?
I am very happy to talk about that. I started working with an organization called No More, which you might be familiar with if you watch football, because they do quite a lot of PSAs during football games. No more excuses, no more abuse. It's a blue sort of circular device, and it's a symbol. And I worked on creating this symbol with a woman named Christine Mao, who was then the global design director at Kimberly-Clark. And Kimberly-Clark was one of the organizations that had joined with this consortium of companies and organizations to help fund the No More movement, which was about eradicating sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. And I started working with this organization and developed their branding, their symbol, and their positioning. And while I was doing that, I met a woman named Miley Zambuto, who is the CEO of one of the organizations that was helping to incubate and birth this effort, which is the Joyful Heart Foundation. Turns out the Joyful Heart Foundation was founded by Mariska Hargitay, the star of Law and Order SVU. Mm-hmm. When she started on that show, she was doing quite a lot of research about victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse. And when she started on the show, and the show's been going now 18 years, she was struck by the amount of mail that she began getting, wherein people were telling her their stories about sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse. And she felt that she had an opportunity, or maybe an obligation, to start a foundation to help eradicate this violence. And so in the process of working on No More with Miley, she then asked me if I would be interested in helping the Joyful Heart Foundation with their repositioning and with their identity. And of course, I said yes. And so I started working with Miley and Mariska, two women who are badass forces of nature who are changing the world. And I worked with them both on the repositioning and the board of the Joyful Heart Foundation, and worked with my students at the School of Visual Arts, my grad students. We launched the new identity at Lincoln Center in May of 2016 with Joe Biden, with Vice President Biden, which was amazing. And shortly thereafter, they asked me to join the board. And so I have recently joined the Joyful Heart Foundation board. And given what we talked about earlier in the show about my background and my history, the strongest statement that I could make, or the most sincere statement I could make about the work that I'm doing with the Joyful Heart Foundation, is that it helps me make sense of my life, make sense of my whole life. And it's the most important, most meaningful, most fulfilling work that I could possibly do. And if my knowledge of branding and how to influence a culture to change and to help eradicate this violence in any way, my whole life will have been worth living.
Wow. Well, thank you very much for all the work that you're doing on behalf of Joyful Heart Foundation. And we will make sure to include all the links in our show notes so that anybody who hears this story and wants to get involved or make a donation of any sort, they can find all the information.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I'm just wondering if there's anything left on that 5-year plan that you made in Milton Glazer's workshop. Like, is there anything left you need to conquer while you're still in this life form?
Oh, I'm just getting started. That's the nice
All right.
about
hear that.
About life. As long as you're living, there's an opportunity to do something meaningful. I was talking to Paula Scher about aging. She told me that the 50s were her best decade. You're just at a point now where you've accomplished enough, you're still young enough to do a lot more, and people take you seriously. and it's right on. I mean, she is such a role model as somebody that has not even yet peaked. And she's had this career of decades of making meaningful work. And I can only hope to have 1/10 of the influence that she's had. But I feel very similarly that the older I get, the more there is to do and the more I feel like I can do. And maybe it comes from that sort of repetitive success of any endeavor. But I feel like I'm just getting started and there's still so much more that I can't wait to do.
Well, you made a comment at the beginning about a center needing to buoy itself. And I just want to tell you thank you because I feel like you've buoyed my center.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for doing this great podcast. It's such a good podcast. What you're doing is so wonderful. And congratulations on all the success that you've had doing it.
Yes. Well, thank you for forging the path for the rest of us. My gosh, you've been doing your podcast now for 12 years. I mean, that's incredible.
I love it. And I've listened to it so many times and just been so amazed at your demeanor, but also your insightful questions. And it's the kind of thing that has worked in the background to inspire me. And by worked in the background, I mean, it keeps working after I'm not listening to it. And it keeps kind of influencing my thought process. And so thank you, for clearing the way for people like us.
Anytime.
So where can listeners find you on the web, on social media?
Pretty much at Debbie Millman, DebbieMillman.com, and Design Matters on iTunes and on Design Observer and sva.edu.
Thank you so much for your time, Debbie.
Yeah,
we really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Amy.
She has the most soothing tenor to her voice. I felt like she was the voice of my conscience telling me everything's going to be okay.
I was thinking about that too. And as she was talking, I felt like I saw parallels with her life and your life.
Mine, really?
Yeah, except I feel like she's further down the path.
Oh, for sure.
Because she talked about I'm getting deep here, Amy.
Okay.
So she's talked about her fear of relying on herself. And she was afraid she would end up homeless. And I was like, Amy has a fear of ending up homeless. And I wonder if it's because she doesn't rely on herself.
Believe me, that was resonating with me really hardcore when she was saying that. And I have been recently really checking in on all of those fears and figuring out like how they're holding me back or how they're helping me. Mostly they're just holding me back. And so I did feel like that was very much a parallel.
What resonated the most with me was her idea of courage versus confidence, because I have a lot of confidence in myself for a lot of different things that I do now, but I have a lot of fear for other things. And so I think it's about developing that courage to grow and to take those first steps. And then you become confident, but it's really the courage that you need to develop. And that's most important in that relationship.
Yeah, I think her painting a picture of letting go of the trapeze was really, really powerful.
Oh my God, when she said that, I was like, how many limbs do I have? Because I feel like I've got 10 trapeze that I'm holding on to, and I only have 4 limbs, and I don't know how this is working. I'm like an octopus, like 8 arms, 8 trapeze. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I think it's a protection mechanism. We think if we can sort of feather the nest with as many things that we're confident with, right, then we can afford to fail at a few of them and we'll still be okay. But I think what she was saying about letting go of the trapeze is that some of those things are suffering if you don't put your full energy into them.
Right. And then there's also the sense of like, you won't grow until you can get out of your... I mean, it's cliche, but it's like a comfort zone, right? Where you become confident, you become almost complacent because you're surrounded by things that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And the unknown is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't know what's going to happen when you let go, but you have to have the the courage to let go and then, take the next step.
I'm going to go a step farther and say that maybe even by the time you're in your 50s, you can develop the confidence of repeated tasks, not because you're doing the same thing each time, but because you've had the courage to take different steps enough in your life and been okay, that you can develop the confidence to be courageous. Did I just get super meta?
Yeah. It's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know.
But I do worry about aging, and she made me feel so excited to be a woman in my 50s. I can't wait.
I know. I'm like, 50 is the new 30. I'm so excited.
I know. And I think when we're young, we have this really stupid and ridiculous idea of older people as being past their prime or overripe or stuck in their ways. And it doesn't have to be that way. And we also think of them as irrelevant because we think they're not as hip. But think of how much power you have when you have all that experience at your disposal and people take you seriously and you can get shit done. And she's doing such meaningful work. And she's finally able to really, I think, enjoy how it's impacting the world because it's making sense to her why she had to go through all those hardships.
Yeah, and she's able to channel all of that energy into something totally positive, which not everybody can do.
Well, and it sounds like it takes work, which also makes me feel better because, I don't know, I don't trust those people where they're just like, it comes naturally. I don't believe them.
I know, I was really relieved when she was like, it's hard to be creative. I'm like, oh, okay.
Then I'm not doing it wrong.
It's not just me.
Yeah.
Well, she's a delight.
It's very much so.
Delight. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to go back and re-listen to all of her podcasts.
I think I want to play it while I sleep too. I just want that ultra suede voice just like massaging my brain as I dream.
Subconsciously influencing you. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Please do us a favor. If you haven't listened to Debbie's podcast, Design Matters, you should absolutely go and check it out right now. And please subscribe to Clever on iTunes, Radio Public, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. And sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and see images of Debbie's work at cleverpodcast.com.
Yes, and connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Clever Podcast. We always love to hear from you. This episode of Clever was edited by Chris Modal of Your Studio with music by L1011.